So tonight we're in our roundtable. We're discussing lighting design for opera, and I'm not going to give you. I think we're getting some feedback somewhere. I'm not going to give you any sort of spiel on my end tonight. I'm gonna pass you over to Duane Schuler here, who has graciously helped us put together this wonderful panel and roundtable of industry professionals. And Duane will let us know kind of how things are going to go and handle introductions from there. So, Duane, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all again. And we're here tonight to try to help you decide, what you're going to do with your life after this pandemic is over, and give you any information we can about the world of opera lighting design. Let's just start all this by having everybody that's on the that is not on a mentor, or all of the mentors at least, just introduce yourself, a quick overview of who you are, where you are working now, and where you have worked in the past, and how you got into this silly business. So I'll actually start. I started out at the Guthrie Theater years ago. You heard some of this last time we saw each other, and then all of a sudden I was working for Gil Hemsley at the time. I actually went to school with, it was the first class that Gil ever taught. I was in that class, and he was doing a lot of work for the Boston Opera. So I worked with him at the Boston Opera when I was still in school. And then I ended up at the Guthrie Theater because he was also working there. So my career is very much based on having met Gil Hemsley when I was a sophomore in college and working for him after I graduated. But while I was at the Guthrie, he was asked to light some shows for the Lyric Opera in Chicago, and I was lighting, and they asked me to light some of the shows as well. So I started the Lyric in 1977, and I've been working there on and off ever since. So that sort of brought me into the opera world. And so I've done opera at the Lyric, and then because of the Lyric, my entire opera career is based on my having worked at the Lyric, because you meet designers and directors there, and they take you other places. So that's where I started, and I won't go into any more of the places I've been now. We'll talk about some of that later. So why don't we have Connie for a second then? Go for it, Connie.
Sure. Hi, my name is Connie Yun, and I'm based out of Seattle, Washington. I got into the business primarily through the apprenticeship program at Santa Fe Opera, which has an extensive singer and technician apprenticeship program. So I did that after my sophomore year in college, and sort of caught the bug from that. And then through that, I started freelancing as an assistant lighting designer for designers that I met through that program. And then my boyfriend at the time, now husband, we decided to relocate to Seattle, and they had just opened 2 out of 4 of the shows of a ring cycle presentation. And for some personnel issues, they decided to sort of revamp their lighting supervisors that were attached to the program. And Peter Kazarowski, who I knew through other people, knew that I lived there and suggested they look at hiring me. So that's sort of how I started my relationship with Seattle Opera, starting in 2001. And I've worked off and on with them since then. And again, through that, I met a lot of other lighting designers and assisted, and then started to design for Seattle Opera for their Young Artist program, and then the main stage, and then started to design for a number of regional opera companies on a much smaller tier scale. So that's sort of how I got into it.
All right. How about Chris Maravich?
I got into the business in grad school. I had never heard of opera before I was in grad school. I never saw an opera before grad school. I didn't know anything about opera. One day I was flirting with a girl who was working in a costume shop, and a friend of ours called asking for any lighting designer that she might know who could assist on an opera in Chautauqua in upstate New York. I then flew to upstate New York and spent a summer in upstate New York, experienced an opera for the very first time. And I met the stage manager there, who then hired me to be a assistant lighting designer for a company in Southern California. I then worked the summer in Southern California as an assistant lighting designer, who the stage manager's husband was the stage manager at the San Francisco Opera. And then I moved to San Francisco, where I became the assistant lighting designer on staff at San Francisco. And eventually I turned into the lighting director at San Francisco Opera. And then I moved to Chicago, where I am now as the lighting director at the Lyric Opera Chicago. and I design half a dozen shows every year at the Lyric, and do some freelance work in and around the country and abroad. And there we go.
Okay.
My life in a nutshell.
How about Justin, since you just took over from where Chris used to be?
I did. My name is Justin. I actually grew up in San Francisco, weirdly enough, and I spent 20 years in New York. I'm the new kid in opera. I have not done opera very long. I worked for Chris Maravich in 2011 as the assistant, and then 2012, and then went back to New York. And recently, in May of 2018, took over in San Francisco. So that's my story.
Okay, so you came out of the theater world and back into the opera world.
Yeah, I mean, I saw my first opera when I was 16 in the San Francisco Opera or more Opera House. So it's a good full circle.
You got it. How about Eric?
Hello, I'm Eric Watkins. I'm freelance lighting designer out of Chicago at the moment. I got into opera by being Chris Maravich's intern, later his assistant at the San Francisco Opera. That's where I met Justin when he showed up a couple of seasons later. Eventually, I moved to Chicago and worked for Chris at the Lyric Opera of Chicago. I met Duane there, I think. I've been back to San Francisco a couple of times. I've freelanced at smaller regional opera houses and some larger regional opera houses. And once I got to go abroad taking a show from San Francisco, which was a bit of fun. That's how it worked out for me.
I think you're beginning to see a pattern here about this business, on this side of the business at least, is that everybody knows everybody else and they've all worked for everybody else. And it's a very, very small little group here. So let's go with Michael Clark from New York.
Hi, I'm Michael Clark. I am from New York. I'm currently talking to you from Gainesville, Florida, but I am from New York. And I'm not a lighting designer. I'm actually a scenic and projection designer, but I've been fortunate enough to work with at least one or two of you in the room on other projects in the past, and I've done productions for the now defunct Baltimore Opera. And I sort of keep the world alive by doing crazy new experimental operas to see where they're going to go.
And Michael Clark from Houston.
Hi, everybody. I'm the other Michael Clark. Check test. This is my season here in Houston at Houston Grand Opera. I got my start out in the business. I got into, similarly Connie, I went to Santa Fe right out of college. Ended up doing an internship there for the summer. Came back as a staff member the next summer and spent 7 seasons with them. About my second season there, a switch up was happening in Houston, and my boss in Santa Fe at the time, Carolyn, had worked in Houston, and you should apply there, see what they'll do. Applied, got an interview, got the job. Was an assistant here in Houston. Did another switch up, and my boss then left the business for a while. And they said, "So you're here. Do you want the job?" And I said, "Sure." And I ended up staying here, working here, and Santa Fe for another few years, and then just here. Like I said, this is my 14th season. The staff head of lighting.
Okay, and then John Fraley from the Metropolitan Opera. You're next.
Hey, how's everybody tonight or this afternoon, wherever you are? My roller coaster ride, I actually started at a military academy and then got myself really hurt and had to figure my life out again. I couldn't be a helicopter pilot. So I went to undergraduate at the University of Montana and then figured that I got a lot of experience there, but I didn't really get a lot of professional contacts. So I went to graduate school for 1 year at the University of Connecticut. And at that time, they were starting a new internship program with the Metropolitan Opera. And I was the only one with the professional skill set that the Met needed. So I nod in the first year, and then the technical director at the end of my internship said, "Do you want a job?" So I said, "Well, that sounds like an opportunity I can't pass up." So I worked in the technical department there for a few years. Then I bounced over to classical ballet world. I was a TD for a while, for about a year and a half at the American Ballet Theater. Then I worked for Local 1 doing layout engineering. And after that, I moved to London, and I was the TD at English National Opera for a while. And then I got a call to come back to the States from the Metropolitan Opera, saying there was an opening in the lighting office, and I have been there ever since. I worked under Wayne Chenard for a brief spell, and then he retired, and Christina Ginelli worked there, and then I took over, I think in 2011. I'm sure. So I've been there for a while, in and out. So.
Okay, look, are you all set there, John? Okay, so I guess you can quickly see that it's a very varied background in how we got into this business, but it also is all of us have worked with each other often, and there's no one right path or a straight line to this business, but there's many ways to end up where you end up. So I think one thing I think the first question I want to ask the group in general is sort of, what is the difference between lighting opera and then as opposed to lighting something in the theater and the dance world? For me, I think I'll do a couple of things that, number one is that the schedule is usually very, very different. Often in the opera world, especially in the bigger houses, you actually will do something called a summer tech, where you're actually lighting the opera before the opera's been staged, which for anybody that's in the theater world, it's just something they can't even begin to figure out. As I'm sure that everybody else, the heads nodding are the people that's saying, yeah, I've sat there watching a director just say, well, I don't even know where the people are going to be. How can we light this? And so I always tell them to look at it as basically, it's a big, you've got the model box in front of you and you can stage the show, but in real scale with the light walkers that are up there walking around. So what you'll do is you'll write basic light cues for the entire opera in the summer, and then in the fall it'll come back, and all you have is a piano run through and 2 stage orchestras and a final dress. So it's a very, very quick. It's a quick turnaround. You don't have a lot, and then you have no previews, as opposed to the theater world where you have previews and everything else. So it's it isn't, and the reason that's done is because of the schedule. I mean, opera is usually, not all, but many times it's in repertory, and you don't have enough time to actually do the texts during the season without working nothing but night gangs, which is not wise for anybody or financially viable. So it becomes something that you get a lot of the work done ahead of time, but it's a different process completely. But I do have to say, in the end, you're doing exactly the same thing as you're trying to do with the play. You're trying to tell the story. You're trying to make it look as beautiful as possible or as threatening as possible, whatever it might be. And it's simply, what you're trying to accomplish is exactly the same. So you shouldn't ever think that it's a completely different world at all. There's just a lot of different methods of making it happen, and different schedules, and often different equipment, but it's in the end it's all the same process. So I'm going to let somebody else jump in as far as their take on what's different about lighting an opera.
I think for me, one of the like Duane was saying, it's the schedule, but the other thing is the reason the schedule is also that insane is because the thing that makes opera very different than theater is the scale. In order to put an opera on stage, it's hundreds upon hundreds of people just to get a singer on stage singing a song. So whereas a play could require 100 people to put it on stage, an opera requires 500 people to put it on stage. So we can't necessarily have that same, okay, now move to stage left like you do, and we'll spend 20 minutes lighting this next scene. We literally you're lucky if you have an hour or two without the singers on stage lighting the show. Everything just happens while the singers are happening, while the rehearsals happen. We never stop. We never go back. Just go, 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 go. And you have to get your ducks in a row and get it straight. The other thing about the scale is the fact that on a theater situation, your proscenium is maybe 30 feet wide, 35 feet wide. Our proscenium is 50 feet wide. The Met's proscenium is, I don't know, a football field wide. So Everything is just so much bigger. Your lights are just bigger. But again, when you break it all down, in a theater world, you've got a 6-inch Fresnel. Well, that's cute and all that. In the opera world, we've got a 4K Fresnel, which is gigantic in size, but it does the exact same thing that a 6-inch Fresnel does. It's just our lights are bigger because our light is 60 feet in the air as opposed to 20 feet in the air on the grid. It's just the scale is bigger, but the nuts and bolts of it, it's identical. We're trying to tell a story. We're trying to let the performer on stage so the audience can see it. We do the exact same nuts and bolts that a light designer needs to do. It's just everything is just opera scaled.
And it's better because it's opera, but let's just.
Jumping in here, I think one of the things that I would say that is a little different is sometimes you have to work in slightly broader strokes because of the time schedule and because of how much square footage literally you're trying to cover. And also the other thing I think that's unusual in opera is that particularly in the repertory houses, you'll have multiple people that will sing a role. So there is not quite the same level of staging precision that sometimes you can expect in theater. So you have to be prepared to accommodate what might be lapses in recollection about staging or reinterpretations about what that staging might be. So it's just something to be aware of as a designer. You have to sort of build in a little bit of space for what might happen.
And another thing about opera, which may be very obvious, is you have the music there. Very similar to a musical, like you can listen to it months in advance and you can figure out where the cues go or where the emotional high is or where the important part of a scene that you don't know what the set looks like at that point, or maybe you do, but you definitely don't know what the staging is going to look like. But you know that here something needs to look a certain way. Something needs to be beautiful or threatening or whatever.
Right. There's nothing like a key change to motivate a light cue. That's for sure.
There's also that contact time with performers, which is diminished a little bit. And I would say it's less in opera. It's like you don't have the same amount of rehearsal time that you would have in the theatrical product or principals, your chorus. You really only have you go through it once or twice and with them, and then you're done. As opposed to in a theatrical environment where you might have that rehearsal every day for days.
Right. Exactly.
Meaning that you need to know those characters a lot more, and you need to understand those performances a lot better and be more organized when you're walking into the opera environment.
The thing that makes it tricky with the schedule is, like Duane was saying, you've got the summer tech. So what will happen is you'll tech the show. You won't know anything. You won't know where the singer's going to stand. The director, if they're prepared, will have a better idea. And then you'll leave it for 3 months. And then you'll come back, and if you're lucky, you'll see a rehearsal. One rehearsal. And then you'll frantically take down notes. One of the first jobs I ever had in opera, I was flown from Boston to LA to work on a show. I arrived in LA as an assistant, and I didn't know the designer. I didn't know anybody except the stage manager. I arrived after a 5-hour-long flight for a 7 o'clock rehearsal. So in my mind, it's 11 o'clock at night. He hands me the score to Cosi fan tutte, which is this thick. And he says to me, I need you to keep track of where we are. I barely understand how to read music. So I sit there for 4 hours. I'm following the score of this opera along, and I have no clue what's going on. He's frantically taking notes, saying, Fiorigi, stay on stage left at this moment. He's taking charts and all that stuff. The next day, he has to focus the show. And then that afternoon, he starts writing light cues. And then that night is the piano rehearsal. So it is just like that. You've got to know exactly. And you barely have a chance the next day to change something. Otherwise, you just have to have all of your ducks lined up and ready to go and have solutions for all the problems that you have. It's much more challenging than when you in a play where you can stop for the lighting designer and says, I need to light this moment. You don't have that time.
You don't have that.
You got to, like Connie was saying, broad strokes. You can't be finicky. You can't be tricky with that. You've got to have, hey, I want side light that's blue. On the blue, smooth side on.
In that same vein, I remember the first time I worked at the Met, I was working with Wayne Chenard, and he could tell that I was, because everything we was saying is completely true, but twice as real at the Met, I think, as far as schedules and time and lack of time. And And I was sort of used to making a list of notes and dealing with it later. And Wayne said, no, if there's anything you want to do it right now. Just say it out loud because it'll happen. And the other thing is you have 40 electricians that are standing by. If you want to do a color change, just do it. You don't sit there and make a list and then say, well, tomorrow morning we're going to change this color, because you don't have a focus call the next morning to fine tune it. You have to refocus the entire rig from the night before, which is one of the other big issues with opera. You're constantly refocusing. You don't focus it once and then let it sit there for the run of the show. You're focusing it from the night before. But I remember Wayne saying to me, it's like a train and it's going to keep moving and you have to jump on, because otherwise it's going to run you over. You just have to jump on this train and the pace of your work is set by the institution, not by what you want it to be. And then, and the same thing about pace is what somebody mentioned earlier about music. I mean, you do have music there, and the music is driving the entire show. And what's happening in the pit is they're the only ones that can make something start and stop. Nothing else will stop the show unless there's something in danger or whatever. But it's the conductor is running this show, and if he wants to stop and go back, he can. And often we pray for the conductor to say, let's do that sequence again, because that gives you a chance to do a little cleanup work. But otherwise, just because you think you might like to redo that moment, you're not going to get that opportunity. And
the thing that's funny is, like Duane said, we often pray that the maestro will stop. But we also pray that the soprano or the tenor will stop in their light, because 9 times out of 10, they'll keep going, and I'll just sit there at the table like this, praying for the tenor to stand in his light for once in our lives, because we're not going to be able to stop and say, stand here. No, they're going to go wherever they want to go. Slew, I'm sorry, I saw that you popped up. You have a question?
I do have a question. I know that you guys have been talking about having the music beforehand, which is obvious that you would. But how do you deal with, like, operas typically, from my understanding, I haven't seen that many, are generally in different languages, like French or Italian. How do you deal with that if you don't speak the language? I mean, sure, you can tell by tone and timbre, but there are probably some nuances in there. How do you deal with something like that, not speaking the language of whatever the opera is?
I mean, yeah, research the libretto. I mean, you should, I will say that probably 75% of the time when I get a piano vocal score, it's often not with an English translation. So, I mean, sometimes you're like, oh, wonderful, I have an Italian score with a German translation. Not helpful.
Oh, isn't that best?
So you have to do the work. You have to go and get a good libretto and do the research of figuring out what is the best translation, because that's the other thing that can be hard in opera is you'll find an English translation that is actually not accurate to what they're actually saying, but is actually more just trying to match the rhythm and the pattern that they want you to sing. So it's like you have to kind of you have to find the right resources, basically. But it is I think that's part of the responsibility of the designers, is to do that homework.
Great. I think Broderick has a question as well.
Hey, how you doing? Once again, thank you for the information. I really appreciate it. My question to you is, how do you take an idea and make it tangible in the opera aspect? Like the process. I want to, tap into the process.
So, I think for me at least, the process when I approach it, one thing that's tricky to understand about opera is I'm going to ballpark, I'm going to say there's 100 operas. And I don't know, Duane, how many times have you lit Così?
Probably about 6 times.
Yeah, so we will do the same opera over and over and over again, just completely different versions of that same opera, which makes it kind of challenging. But I will read the opera, read the libretto like a play, especially if it's an opera I've never done before. I'll read it just like a play and find out what happens. And then I'll buy the CD or download the CD or the whatever you do these days, and I'll listen to the opera, listen to it without any notes, nothing. I'll just listen to the music, just get a feel for it, and I'll stop and I'll do it again. This time I'll start taking notes about, oh, that person does this, that person does this. Then I'll get the score, and I'll listen to the opera again with the score next to me, and I'll have a sheet of paper that says, on this page, like Eric was saying, the key change, something important is going to happen here, and I'll write down and I'll make notes about what happened, and I'll have a complete list of everything I need to go. It needs to be a dark and stormy night. I'll write down, I need to light a dark and stormy night. And I'll make a list of all the things I need to do for the show. And I'll go through it. It's like dark and stormy night. They sing about the windows. I need to have windows in the thing. And I'll make a list I call it the task list, about all the things I need to put into the plot. And then after I get that, then I'll start figuring, that basically turns into the plot. Then I get the set design, and I'm figuring, like, I need all these things to make the show happen. And I've gone through and I've understood the play, I've researched the play, I've done all 9 yards, and that gets me my whole plot and how I get the idea on stage.
The other thing I'll point out about this, though, is often in opera, there's often in the bigger houses, often a repertory plot in place already. So, and it's not always the case. In some companies, you have complete freedom to do any plot you want. In other cases, there's a plot hanging, and because they're in repertory, you have to work within the boundaries of that plot, and then you push those boundaries as much as you can. But you do have limitations, and some people think that's a huge limitation. I actually think if it's a decent rep plot, it's not a huge limitation. It's how you use it. It's not what's hanging up there all the time. Because if it's a good rep plot, you can usually do almost anything you need. And if it's if you need something special, the houses are usually very, very accommodating if there's any physical way to do it. Oh, stop shaking your head, Chris. You're more accommodating than most people. But you do have to work in those boundaries. But I mean, you're going to need a backlight system. You're going to need a high side system. You're going to need all those things, and those probably can be found. And you can also break them up any way you want. You don't have to go with, most rep plots have fixtures, some that are fixed focus like a backlight system, but the rest is all fair game. You can use it or not. So it's not as if you're stuck by just having a rep plot. At the same time, you need to, you really need to do your homework ahead of time, because all the electricians in the house are going to know that plot inside and out, and they'll be saying, well, do you want to use 801? And you think, well, what the hell is 801? Well, they know what 801 is because they've used that same channel number for the last 10 years. So you want to try to get the house plot into your head as much as you can. The other big difference is, I know a lot when I started doing. Initially, you do your own hookups, and you can say, well, 1 through 10 are going to be area lights 1 through 10, or something like that. When you're in the opera world, you often have to deal with a hookup that is completely at the whim of the lighting supervisor, and you have to do with their channel numbers, because they can't repatch the entire show every day, because the guys do need to know which lamp they're going to focus when somebody says go focus 801. So it's there are some limitations like that just demand you kind of wrap your head around the house you're in, as opposed to saying, well, this is the way I always do it.
So going off of what Duane was talking about, a repertory system is one of the big parts of opera lighting design is the house staff. That's one of your first entry points into the opera world is house staff. And as Eric mentioned earlier, he's taken his show from San Francisco to another place. Is one of the things that makes opera different than theater, but not so much different than dance, is that in the opera world, we will often take the physical show and take it to other places. Other places will rent the scenery, rent the costumes, and we'll have to go back and relight the show. But what makes it challenging is they're not going to have the exact same gear in the exact same place at all. So, and sometimes that show, you did that show 4 years ago. You did that show 10 years ago. So you have, part of being a lighting staff member is being a librarian, is being able to archive that show so that 10 years later you can say, what did 801 do? I can't remember. And you have to figure out how to make the intent behind the lighting design turn into the new lighting plot that you have, because you're not going to get that same fixture in the same place. One time I took a show, and it was it was like a Broadway play, a Broadway musical, and it was all these moving lights everywhere. I had 2 lights that were the same fixture. Everything else was vastly different. I didn't have movers. I had to figure out, I went through sheets and sheets and sheets and sheets of tracking of these moving lights to figure out how many times it moved, what color it moved, where it went, and what it did. And it was fascinating for me as a wannabe librarian to figure out how to make that show happen in another venue. And thank God I had a great staff when I got there. And it was when we took Carousel, and Michael Clark was actually the staff there, and he was able to make that plot happen. And like Duane was saying, you lean on those house staff to make shows happen for you, because without that house staff, you're just screwed.
Just of emotion, obviously, and understanding what those systems are and how they're going to convey that emotion that you're going to need. What is that backlight system going to do for you? What is that high side system going to do for you in your storytelling? And being able to understand the concept of the tools that you have or have not based upon the rep situation that you're putting yourself into. So when you're looking at the process that you're talking about, it's like, yes, you have to go through and you have to read and you have to identify with what the characters are going through. And then you have to figure out what is going to set that mood, how you're going to use these systems to set the mood to convey that information across to the audience. And I think that what they're talking about here is extremely advanced and wonderful in terms of giving you that information of where you go to do that, but it's also understanding the tools that you have at your disposal and what they're going to do for you.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think when you can sort of distill what it is that you're trying to communicate, what is your storytelling happening, and then compare that to what your resources are, you're going to tell that story slightly different in every circumstance, based on, do I have 12 lights? Do I have 200 lights available to me? Am I working in a black box? Am I working in a proscenium or in a thrust? So, but ultimately, I think when it comes down to it, you probably have a core thing that you want to be communicating via the lighting. So, and I think that's important to understand, what is that core first, and then look at what your circumstances are to figure out what your best options are to communicate that.
I was just going to say, when you get on site, sometimes surprises happen and the schedule doesn't allow you to get exactly what you want. So, especially with a rep plot, don't be precious. If you always like high side and they have a pipe-in system, that will work just fine in 95% of the circumstances. Or if you show up on site and sometimes things were hung wrong in Lithuania, or they don't have tall booms, or whatever it is. So, broad strokes get you a lot farther than obsessing over the details, especially if you can't do anything about it in the moment. You
Good
obsess over
advice.
the details early. Obsess over the details early, but when you get on site, make it happen.
This is all really great conversation. I think it's kind of getting some thoughts going in the minds of the students as well. And I know that I think we have about 4 questions here. So I'd love to. I think Mitchell has a question first, and then we have a couple of others. So let's go to Mitchell.
Yeah. So Connie, you brought up something earlier about building space for actors because they're not going to follow their blocking every single night, or it might be different people. I was curious what techniques or ideas you guys use to build in that space without making your cues just all huge and mushy or doing bouncing follow spots the entire show.
That's a good question. So we definitely, I would say in the opera world, we do oftentimes rely pretty heavily on follow spots as an opportunity. The other thing you'll often see is greater reliance on footlighting in there, which allows you to sort of have a little bit more flexibility in where a person is. And I think you can still create interesting looks without being like, you must stand on this X. But I would say the other thing too is you're like, well, a special in opera might not be like, a 4-foot wide circle. It might be a 12-foot wide circle.
It's interesting, too, if I can chime in for a second, about how we're all talking about systems and preparing and having so much your head into the music to the point where you've almost memorized it and stuff. It's funny, I don't know how anybody else feels, but I've almost gotten to the point where I don't even though I'm putting systems up in the air, by the time you get through collaborating with the scene designer, talking with the director and everything, I don't even think in terms of system. I think in terms of pictures that I've created in my mind that are cues, because just like in theater or dance or Broadway, you could just add more and more and more cues. But like what Chris says, it's funny, you get so focused on the music and all of a sudden, I've done 5-hour-long operas with 30 cues, and it's what Connie said as well. You then say, oh, well, a nicely sculpted soft follow spot will solve 15 cues and save me 4 hours, so I can really refine the artistic idea more and not lose it in oh my God, I didn't get this system right, like Eric said, or this and that. And you just be like, no, this is the idea, and I can move it a little bit, or I can shape it, and just not get tied into it. So you get a really solid foundation, kind of falls apart in the process, but you have to keep those major moments going and you'll be okay. You know?
And I think the important thing about what John said is follow spots is that, you know, they don't have to be hard edged and look like a musical at all. I mean, and fortunately in opera houses, you have often a lot of very, very good operators who will give you a very, very delicate follow spot as opposed to somebody that just doesn't care and is all over the stage and whatever. You have some operators that really are very proud of the work they do. And without them, you couldn't get away with the amount of follow spots that you sometimes use, but they certainly they can be very, very, very discreet. I mean, I've had directors that say, I hate follow spots, I'm never going to use them. And halfway through the process, I managed to convince him to give him a try. And at the end, he'll even forget that there are follow spots, but he'll be very happy with the way the show looked. So, I mean, it's all a question of how you can fine tune things like follow spots to help you deal with the fact that the singer's not always going to be on the same spike, and it won't be a disaster, as opposed to the singers, you know, dying in the dark because they are 6 feet further stage right. That you know, so it's sort of a win-win having follow spots there, even as a backup if something goes wrong. I mean, you know, and not as much now, but I know when we started using moving lights in the beginning, you know, you almost always had to build in a special in addition to the moving light in case the moving light wasn't working that night. And so I wouldn't say we're at that point anymore, but it certainly was something you had to consider. So follow spots can certainly help with that area too. All right, you said another question?
Yeah, let's go to Phil. Phil has a question next. I think you're muted there, Phil. There you go.
Hi, how are you? I've never did lighting for opera before. I've only done projection, but I have assisted in lighting for the opera. My first opera was actually Così fan tutte in a projection standpoint. But my question is, I guess like with visualization becoming more and more thing, at least in the theater world, has the opera world kind of embraced visualization as well, even if it is in a rep plot?
I'll start that one. I think 10 years ago, when you went to work at Covent Garden at the Royal Opera House, you actually had to go a few days early and pre-focus all of your units up. They had a special room built on the top of the building where you actually had the model in 3D, and they had a light board there, and you would actually focus all the moving lights up there before we got down into the theater. And then on Sunday, which was the lighting day at the Royal Opera House, you had 90% of the show of the moving lights focused. I don't know, you might know, John, but I don't think they're doing that anymore, because what's happened is that the operators have gotten so good that you really don't need to do that step. Operators have gotten really, really, really good at focusing as you're going. And often as you're focusing conventional fixtures, your assistant or somebody will also be focusing moving lights for you at the same time. So you're actually getting more things focused at one time. But I wouldn't say that the opera world has actually embraced the virtual focusing. What does anybody else think?
Yeah, I don't think it really has. I mean, we have used it to the Met a few times, and it's kind of, Duane, you're very right about the fact that, the way that we work at the Metropolitan Opera and other places is that usually there's two programmers working in unison, so we can get, and then on staff at the Met, there's myself, and then I have an associate and two assistants, and then with the visiting lighting designer, there's sometimes 5 people on stage, and the programmers oftentimes can work on 2 different moving lights at the same time. So we could have 4 different people focusing. Getting documentation of all that then gets a little crazy.
Exactly.
But yeah, as far as visualization, especially at the Royal, I was having a discussion last time I was over there, and they're starting to use the studio kind of more on the front end of the creative process, like storyboarding and like getting rough ideas, trying to get the director over. And the major hurdle for us at the Met is that using it the way that the Royal used to do it, or any other place, like come in a week early, and then designer availability, and also because it's summer tech, you don't know where anybody's going to be standing. You're not going to know these things, and it's more of an organic discussion with the director of like, oh, well, it might be over here somewhere. So that's kind of the major reason why I never took hold at the Met. But we are still thinking about actually adapting it to start like an early stage of collaboration kind of by Zoom. Like right now we're working on, I don't know, like 11 productions right now, and we're in a pandemic. So we're trying to find new and interesting ways to convey creative ideas. So we're kind of delving into it seriously for the first time right now.
We touched on that as well, John, with the idea of technology as well. It's like the idea for pre-visualization is a great way to show people that are not technically inclined what technology can do. And so it's not so much as, oh, I'm going to take you beat by beat through my show. I'm not storyboarding this like a film. What I'm doing is I'm giving you a new idea about what the tools can do. And let me show you in a pre-visualization situation some of the alternative things that we'd be able to do with staging and lighting. And that, I think, is the power of pre-visualization, not to just say like, oh, we're going to mark through it like this, like this, like this, like this, because it never sticks. It's never really like that when we get in the room.
So, but even though on the chat we talked about is this for a projection or for lighting, I can tell you we at the Lyric we use Disguise, or formerly known as D3, and they have an excellent pre-visualization workflow that you use there, so you're actually able to see everything happen. And we actually use that quite a lot at the Lyric when we have projection stars come through and we pre-program all the stuff into it. And a lot of times I will take that timeline through Disguise and show the director what the show will look like with regards to projection, at least. And it gets us moving forward a little bit sooner. Not that projection designers don't come through and change everything all the goddamn time. I love projection. I really do. But at least it gets us going.
Great. Thanks for that. I think Bill has a question. Bill Rios.
Hi there. Hey, thank you all for being here. And I was interested in, you were talking about like the scale of everything is giant, and I was wondering if LED technology has matched that scale for opera, and if it has it changed your workflow from process to show at all?
I'll start. I mean, it definitely LED has gotten into our into the opera house world. I think it's sort of the last ones that are accepted, not to accept it, but to use it because of the intensity of the LEDs, and it just wasn't bright enough for a long time. I think the first place where they have become a huge, almost a necessity, is on lighting cycs. They finally are now bright enough to light cycs, and you can cover a cyc with LED, which then also gives you the great luxury of not having to decide which 3 colors you might be using when you really know you want 12 different colors. So it's so LEDs are certainly around for cyc lighting. I also think they're great for foot lighting, and even at this point, I think for any kind of overhead backlight system, they're okay. They're still, you're not going to get a 4K HMI out of an LED yet, and I think you might someday. But there's still there are some places where LEDs just can't quite match it. There's always a big discussion about LED as a front line and what it's like on skin tones, and also front of house. I'm not, the throw distances are just so much greater than they are in many theaters that it's right on the edge. At the same time, I don't think it'll take long before LEDs will be the main fixtures in most theaters, except for the occasional, even HMIs, though, I think are going to go away, just because it's a piece of gear that is incredibly expensive, and to maintain it is difficult. I don't even think people will be making HMI 4K and 6K finales in a few years, because they all came out of the film world, and the film world is now using nothing but LED, I think, or at least pretty much so. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that it makes so much sense to use an LED panel as opposed to 4K HMI that it's going to become the norm. So, but I mean, LEDs are definitely part of the opera world already, and they'll even become more so quickly. Everybody agree?
The other thing too is sound consideration. So because you can have more LED type fixtures front of house, it allows you more opportunities to use that kind of gear in a situation in which people are extremely sensitive about any extra noise happening in the venue. So, I mean, I think that's going to really help push them along in our industry.
And John, you just recently bought a whole slew of LED fixtures, didn't you? At the Met?
No, I just bought a few.
Yeah, that's like 4 or 5.
I think last year I redesigned the overhead lighting rig at the Met, and to give a little history but not bore everybody to death, with all the overhead lighting positions used to be manned positions, and it used to be a la carte lighting, basically, like Duane said, and we would rehang the plot 3 times a day every day, and so it was pretty crazy. Now it's all a standard set of lights. I picked Elation Artistes Monets after trying to collaborate with a lot of different designers, including people who are on this panel. It was a 7-year process, and the last couple of years was just vetting lighting equipment. And it seemed like innovations started to eclipse themselves, every couple, 3, 4 years, even before I started the process. And then at the end of it, I had to pick a spec of lighting equipment and then respec it and spec it one more time, because that's how quickly and how much more flexibility and how much brighter they're going to be. So I think I have something like 80 profiles overhead now, and then I think I've got something like 400 linear feet of LED batten, and it's a big task. And now I have to translate the entire 138 opera repertory over to the rig. So it's going well. I'm going great.
And the thing that's funny about that is John has to translate some shows that are, older than everybody on this panel who's not Duane. So it makes John's life a little more challenging to translate a, 360 Q into an LED fixture. So it makes it good luck picking the color that matches that.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's one thing that, just to touch on, that when we started doing the translation and started using moving lights, like the first step to moving lights was identifying, okay, how many different types of moving lights are we going to allow in this crazy repertory process at the Met? And I'm sure everybody who's doing a job very similar to mine has those same considerations. And then it's the color of everything. And finally, what I, probably just like everybody else here, decided to be like, okay, you have to find an independent variable. Like, what are you going to base colors on now? Because swatch books are just kind of reference relics of the past. Sorry, myself and everybody who wasn't. But you can just pick any color you want now. It's crazy. You just pull up the color picker and you can just touch the screen and it's quite fantastic. But at the same time, to get a huge rig like the Met, that has like 15 or 20 different types and birth dates and everything light, how do you get Lee 201? So every off season, which is not very long, we take a luster tube and every type of moving light we have and every psych batten we have and everything. And the assistant who wronged me the most in the previous season has to sit in the dungeon and update the Metropolitan Opera color swatches. And now we pretty much covered almost all of the gel books. And for $1 million, I'll information with Chris. So over in Chicago. So.
Let me get my checkbook.
Cool. I'm sure I'm going to take that to
it. Another thing that I want to just point out as far as this business and how interconnected it all is, when John changed all of those fixtures at the Met, I was doing a new ballet for American Ballet Theater last spring, just before all of this happened. And in order to, but the American Ballet Theater also performed at the Met in May when the opera is out of season. So in order to take the show that we're going to do and tech it in Orange County, California, we actually rented probably about 30 pictures that the Met had purchased, and we could light the show in Orange County, and that we could make the move into the Met in the one day that we were going to have to do that. So we unfortunately didn't do it this spring because of the pandemic, but I'm hoping next year, the year after, we will move again. But the business is amazingly interconnected in ways like that, and so you'll find that over the years, all the people that you're talking to now will be people that you run into them in different different ways, different places. I remember running into John at the back. He was sitting on the steps at English National Opera at the stage door one night. I was working up the street, and it's just like it's funny how small this business actually is in the big picture. So, next question.
Well, I'll tell you what, Duane, we were talking this afternoon, and a little bit of an interesting conversation, something that you mentioned. So I'll bring this up, and I'll put our students on the spot here for just a moment. I would love a show of hands from our students as who has actually ever attended an opera, gone to see an opera. Some hands. That's good. Who's actually worked on an opera in some way or another? So the conversation, Duane, was, do you need to actually be able to go and have seen opera before you design an opera? And let's talk on that.
Or more so, do you have to love opera in order to
Do you
spend
have to
time
love opera
in the opera house?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
What do we think?
Nobody wants to jump in on that question.
I'll admit it. The first opera I ever saw, I was actually getting paid to work on it. And I was like, what the hell is this strange world?
Same as me.
Same as me.
That's how it happened. You know, it's either that or somebody had a significant other in the business, and they probably have all of us covered. You know, so but I admit it.
I have to say, I do think you do have to like it to some degree, be able to bear it, because it is an unusual art form. I don't know how you could do it if you disliked it. And so I will say, like, for me, I love opera. I'm not a particularly huge fan of musical theater. And even though they seem like they would be quite similar, I'm pretty confident I would not make a great musical theater lighting designer, right? So, and part of that, I think, is probably because I don't love the art form as much. So I do think it does help to cultivate a little bit of likability about the art form. But I don't think you have to necessarily love it per se. I think we all expect to do work in the business that we don't necessarily love.
And it's also, I think, a real acquired taste, because I hadn't spent any time in the opera house before I started working in them. But and initially, it's the same as John. You're like, what is all of this? But all of a sudden, it starts to get into your bones, and you start hearing, you start hearing familiar tunes that kind of bring up a reaction to a moment that you remember, and you think, yeah, this is pretty special stuff. So I mean, it's not something you have to love when you go into it, but yeah, if you, after the first couple of operas, if you're thinking, I just can't stand this loud soprano screeching in my ear, then you probably shouldn't spend any more time there.
I before I did opera, I did 6 years doing nothing but musical theater. So I had an extensive musical theater background, and then all of a sudden, opera turned on, and I never did opera before. I never understood opera, and like Connie was saying, after I did opera for a while, I was like, musical theater sucks, man. Opera is the bomb. and then a couple years ago, a production of Merry Widow came to the Lyric from the Met, and I was fortunate enough to work with one of my idols.
John's laughing.
One of my idols is the director, and I lit this show, and I had the most fun I've had working on opera, because it was opera, but at the same time it was musical theater. So I dug back into my roots, and I was like, ooh, I could use pink and blue. It was exciting. So I was able to light a musical in an opera stage. So it was a lot of fun.
So that opera compared to some of the other forms, because of the logistics, as Chris mentioned earlier, it has to plan out a lot further than some of the other fields. So in terms of quality of life and being able to plan your life a little bit, opera can be very helpful in that way. Also from the economics of it, opera companies and opera fees tend to be more elevated than some of the other fields and companies. So it can be, if you can find your niche in it, it can be a way to actually have the art with the quality of life in a way that I think is maybe a little bit more difficult in some of the other fields.
To kind of jump off what Michael was saying, because like I've only watched, like the first time I ever watched the opera was when I was in grad school, when I was sitting as the first year watching a production, and I remember looking and being like, "Oh my god, I am so not prepared for this." And then in my third year, when I got offered to do the opera, I spent like all summer, like it looked like a conspiracy theory in my office. Like I had like math equations all over like my whiteboard and stuff like that to make sure that every projector was in the perfect spot. And I walked out of that and be like, I have never been so prepared in my life in any production until I started working for the opera for the first time. Because by the time I got to tech, I didn't feel stressed a single time because I was just so prepared, and it was just purely motivated by fear.
Fear is a good motivator.
And I applaud you as a projection designer, to know where your projectors go. Because a lot of times, from my standpoint as the staff person, I'll get projectors that come through and they say, well, that's where the projection goes on that wall. They don't know where projectors go. They don't even know what projectors we use. They could care less. They just want to know where their content goes. So it's exciting to hear a projector designer, understand what a projector is.
Oh yeah, I have like what's it called, storyboards and like the math equations of what kind of lens that I needed to use, because like I originally was a lighting designer, so I had like that photometrics background, so like I couldn't just pick where my projector was going to be. Like my inner lighting designer was just like, no, you need to do the photometrics on exactly what lens it's going to be and how many pixels per square footage is going to be, or square inch is going to be. So yeah, again, like Duane said, fear was a very good motivator.
Phil, you're going to get kicked out of the projection designers group for being prepared. Yeah, it's just not a thing.
Any other questions from our panel? Sorry, go ahead. Yeah, from our students at this point.
Mitchell, go ahead.
Cool. So I know a lot of you guys have kind of fallen into resident positions, and I was curious if you were dreaming of being a resident when you got into this industry and that was the track you were planning to go down, or if it sort of just happened along the way that you found resident assisting or resident designing, and how that process was different.
I can go. I wouldn't say that, as I joke to a lot of people on the panel here, I wouldn't wish my job upon anyone, but it's interesting. I feel like people who take resident positions just are kind of workaholics in a weird way, like artistic workaholics, where I kind of like the pressure, because it's a lot of pressure. Like today I had 6 different meetings about 6 different operas, and on 2 different continents via Zoom. And I'm actually quite relaxed these days because I don't have to fit those conversations around potentially a daytime rehearsal and an evening HD broadcast, So it's one of those things where, was I thinking about this as a career path? Absolutely not. But it's just people just kind of like fall away, and that's not like a badge of honor or anything. It's just you just get drawn to the position. So.
And when I started in San Francisco as a staff ALD, I was only going to be there for 3 years. That was 21 years ago. So I'm actually really bad at leaving. So.
The other thing I think is the Michael Clark touched on the fact that there's more permanence in the opera world at times, and also it's plans much further in advance because the opera schedules are based on the availability of singers and directors, and so they will book their season 2 years out. And so when I was raising a family and trying to keep having a normal life, at least I knew that what I was doing 2 years in advance. It wasn't as if, because the theater world will book you 6 weeks, 6 months in advance max, and the opera world is it's a 2 year lead time. So you have a lot more time to plan your life around your work, as opposed to always being at the same time. You do spend your life on the road, so it's even as a resident, you're often taking shows other places. So you're not. It's not as if you've got a 9 to 5 and you're going to be home for dinner every night. That's not going to happen. But that's something I think everybody in this business has to know before they get into it. If they, as opposed to a lifestyle, it's not an easy lifestyle as far as your day-to-day scheduling. That's for sure.
And I've been a lighting supervisor since 2006 at both the San Francisco and at the Lyric, and I've had a lot of assistants come through, and 2 of them are actually on the call. I always have this discussion with. I worked with Connie 20 years ago. She didn't work for me, but we worked together. It's a small world. But I always have this discussion with my assistants about making what I call the leap, and that is, you could be an assistant, and that's great. But if you want to be a designer on your own, you need to do it when you're young, when you have context, and when you're ready to go. You can't wait until you're 47 years old to decide to be a freelance designer. It's just not going to happen. So I try to kick them out the door when they want to leave. And I kicked Eric out the door a couple years ago because he wanted to move on and be his own designer on his own, which is fantastic for him. And I applaud him, and he does shows now in Chicago. He did up until March 13th. He did shows in Chicago. So and abroad, which is great. But you make that decision. But that being said, when you're 22 leaving grad school, you're going to be a freelance opera lighting designer, it's probably not going to happen. So you need to build a network of people to know. The thing is, lighting designers, I make this joke that lighting designers are usually hired during a drink that the director and the set designer had at a bar. Because they'll sit together and says, well, I said, we're going to do this show. That's great. Who should light the show? And one says, I know this person. Her name's Jennifer. She's great. And that's how the lighting designer got hired. So it's all about context, about people to know. And like I said, I got in this business because I was lucky enough to be standing next to somebody and the phone rang. It has 99% of it is who you know, 1% of it is talent. And that's how you get hired.
And working in a rep situation or working as a resident when you're just starting out, if you're testing the waters for opera, is a great way to figure out if you are comfortable keeping 3 huge grand opera shows in your head all of the time, focusing 300 lights in a 4-hour or less time frame. 30 minutes if you're at the Met, whatever.
Focusing lights between Act 1 and Act 2, which is not done ever in a theater.
Yeah.
I think John, I think John explain the typical schedule at the Met to the students. That would be handy for them to understand how crazy it is your world is.
What's that word typical? I don't know what that means. But just to try to take you through where do I start? Okay, so the season is 26 productions. We could do anywhere. We one time did 10 new productions a year. I almost died, but we usually do between 4 and 6, and the rest of them are repertory revivals. On top of all that, we do 10 HD broadcasts. So on, let's call it a typical day, my staff starts at 8 a.m. A crew has been working the set over, and hopefully it's at a place where we can start plugging stuff in, getting the rig fired up, and start focusing. We focus anywhere between 8 and 9 a.m. to about 10:30. At 10:30 on the dot, maestro or the assistant conductor starts the rehearsal. And as Duane said, sometimes you don't stop until 1:30 or a scheduled break. So we do, that is the afternoon slot called the afternoon rehearsal. The minute that gets done, we do production notes really quickly. While production notes is happening, 2 different crews are ripping apart the set and taking apart the movable parts of the lighting rig and getting ready for the evening performance. Then I go somewhere and I have meetings about either an HG broadcast that's coming up in a couple days that I have to design, 2 or 3 different new productions that have some sort of crisis. I'm looking at samples in a couple different shops or going to the Bronx shop to take a look at something. Then I get back down, we check in on the focusing for the evening performance. If it's an opening, I cover it. If it's HD broadcast, because I have to design them, I do them. And then my assistants watch the rest of the performances. Then they go home and an overnight electrics crew comes in and does the whole thing overnight, and we start the next day. And that goes from the 1st of August until, well, no, that goes from the 3rd week of September until the 1st week in May. That's changing. Before the 3rd week in September, we do August text, where basically I sit down with Duane or Chris or whoever, August 1st, and people next to me rotate, but I just sit there for 30 straight days and do that. So it's an interesting process, but it's pretty full on. So yeah, that's it.
I guess the most important thing as the lighting director is to have a really comfortable chair.
That's really great.
I don't even have legs anymore. It's crazy. I just sit.
I was just going to say a small point about that. If you're coming up as an assistant, when John was talking about someone watching the show, is you're watching to make sure that something doesn't go wrong, and if something does go wrong, so you can fix it in the moment. like the HMI flames out, it's the only light, the curtain's rising on a chorus scene, what do you do? Or whatever else, a spotlight goes out and you have to start calling audibles while they change it because you're using all of your spotlights, or whatever happens. So as an assistant, that is also part of your job, is to know the show you're watching so that you can fix things when something may or may not go wrong.
I think Emma had a question. Emma.
Hi, everyone. Thank you again. This is so awesome. Within the current COVID climate and everything, there's a bunch of theaters and just different practices around. I've been hearing about wanting to cancel out some longer hours or bad practices, as we've had this chance to take a step back and realize we can change some of our schedules and practices that we do moving forward. Is there anything that you guys are seeing that opera is moving towards or away as we're moving through COVID?
I think you're talking mostly about getting rid of 10 out of 12 days is what I imagine. And I think that is actually becoming a real movement but that pertains mostly to the theater world. The opera world doesn't actually usually work as long hours on one production, because first of all, they have the shows in the rep, and they have the morning and afternoon rehearsals, and then a show that night. So you don't have as many options as far as schedule changes anyway. But the days are still actually as long, if not longer, but you're not doing a 10 out of 12 day. The 10 out of 12 days, I think there's a good question as to whether the last 2 hours are very productive anyway. So I actually think it might be the case that 10 out of 12 hours go away in the business. At the same time, when you sit down to do a piano run through of Parsifal, you're there for the next 6 hours minimum, and it could be 8 or 9 hours depending upon how they schedule it. I mean, often on a Wagnerian opera they'll do 2 days of piano run throughs, and they do 2 acts one day and 1 act the next day or something like that. But I think the opera world is much more fixed as far as you're not going to. You're going to do the opera. I actually think the opera world could really consider doing some cutting to some of the old war horses and make them not quite as long, because I think people may not want to sit through 4.5, 5 hours worth of opera. But then the purists would be completely against that idea. So it's a tough call. But I don't know if COVID's going to change any of that. I think people are just sort of desperate to get back into the theater. At the same time, getting into the theater now, spending 6 hours in the theater, I think would frighten a lot more people than spending 90 minutes to see Salome or something. So it might have an impact in that respect.
And like John was saying when he was describing the typical day at the Met, it's there's no fat to cut off that to
right.
remove time. We're already using it up every second that we possibly can, and that's very small as it is. So at the Lyric, we do all of our rehearsals in the afternoon. So we walk away at the latest at 7:00 in the evening, which is a godsend. It's a San Francisco. They leave at 11:00 at night, and it's horrible. But we walk away in the afternoons, and it's glorious. I go home at 4:00. It's fantastic. We can't. There's nothing out of that. So we'll come in, if we're lucky, to have the same show on stage 2 days in a row, and we'll have from 8 till noon to do lighting corrections, and then at 1:00 we rehearse, and we'll walk away at 4:00. So there's no time to cut out of that schedule. But the one thing that there is the financial realities that companies are having being closed for so much time, that we are shaving productions off of our schedules. We're not doing, as John said, these do 10 new productions a year, doing 4 now. So we are cutting back on some things, but it's not because of keeping people safe so much as it is financial realities.
I just got back into the theater in Seattle, and I will say that there were definitely some changes that were sort of mandated by the venue, and I'd be curious to see what the long-term effects are. But they basically said, we're not going to be in the theater on Sundays and Mondays, which is hard. But at the same time, I'm like, oh my God, I don't remember the last time I've consistently had a 2-day weekend forever. So that's kind of great. But then also with all the protocols, at the front end for check-in and briefings and at the back end for sanitization in the space, ultimately we end up actually only getting about 5.5 working hours out of an 8-hour call. So that's a very different thing we have to start navigating. Like, we just are going to have to spend more time sort of dealing with some of these aspects for now. And then what can you actually get done in the time that you have left? So if the company is not willing to spend the extra money to create that lost time. So that's been an interesting thing to navigate right now.
That's great. I think it might be useful for the students to hear. You know, some of you all have touched on hiring and that sort of thing, and I know that Eric talked about being an assistant a bit. What are you looking for? You know, as these students go out and look for work, what are you looking for in someone that you are hiring? What are the qualities? What are the characteristics? What are the skills?
I like people who are organized, who can understand, keep track of their lives together. Because if you come in and you just want to be a designer, that's great. There's a small theater down the street that you can work at. I need somebody who can keep track of organizational details and at the same time have an eye. I like to always say that the best assistant there is the assistant who knows what the designer wants 5 minutes before the designer wants it and is organized enough to give it to them. For instance, when Duane says something doesn't look right in this look, there's that one light that's out of focus, and the assistant says, well, that's light 201. There's Bob, the electrician, standing right next to it. He's ready to refocus it whenever you are. I saw that 5 minutes before Duane saw it. So you have that eye to know what's wrong. And the same token is also when Duane says, I don't know what to do here. What's wrong? And then as an assistant, you can say, I think maybe you should turn the blue skylight on. And then I'm able to help Duane as a designer. So you think like a designer, but at the same token, not be the designer.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing. It's all about the support of it, you know. And Chris and I and probably everybody on the panel has been in the position where you're supporting someone else's creative process. So I tell people I have about 95 different ways of applying a creative process, and you have to be flexible like that. So the one thing, you have to be organized, you have to be flexible. Chris says you have to be mature, but also one thing that's not talked about a lot, you also have to be, like Chris said, confident, but also a calming presence. Creating an opera is stressful, and the person sitting in the first chair gets the most stress. So it's about how to keep it light, how to keep it moving, how to, when you have somebody who's on my staff who's brand new, making sure you can trust them, calm, the visiting lighting designer down, and know that that follow spot track is just being taken care of. So he or she doesn't have to worry about it. And it's just orchestrating that whole thing, keeping calm and keeping moving is good. Every time a lighting designer leaves in a panic, and it's happened mid-rehearsal, I know that I've failed a bit. So, it's calm.
Interesting.
I like to call myself the lighting design whisperer. So when the designer freaks out, I'm able to calm them down and keep them all happy and calm. Don't get me wrong, I will go to my office and blow a gasket, but at that tech table, calm as can be.
Yeah, no one wants to share an office with us, but we're like,
no.
at the table, it's like this.
Yeah, there's an American lighting designer who, if there's a half a second beat left there in that moment, he'll want to add a like you there, and at the same time, he's kind of a pain in the ass, and nobody wants to work with this gentleman. And John knows exactly what I'm talking about. So you want to keep calm with some of these people, because artistic people are the worst. They are the absolute worst.
I'm not saying a word.
It's not Duane. Let's just.
It's interesting. You also though have to know when to speak up and when to hold your peace too. Just having a sense of if this is a very tense situation, you don't have to jump into the middle of it. You just have to be there when something comes up that you can actually help with. You don't have to try to solve the problem, because you can also make the problem much worse. So it's knowing when to jump in and when to just hold your tongue and let the rest of the players have their moments together.
And it's not just opera. It's not just opera that we're talking about too. It's being an ALD for dance, for theater as well. It's the same principle still applies, that you're there to support another person's vision, and you could be sitting next to somebody and it looks like crap, and they love it, but it looks like crap, and you're not there to give your artistic opinion. You're there to just support their crappy lighting design, and that's all that you need to care about.
I kind of like what you guys are saying, like about keeping your goals, stuff like that. But I like, at least for me, like I know because I always come off as always happy and go lucky, even when I'm super stressed. People think that's a good time to come to me when there's a problem. So if anyone has ever been to a Brazilian steakhouse, they have like little like tags. It's like green if you want more food and red if you don't want food. So I stole one of those things one time from a Brazilian steakhouse, and I would leave it by my tech table. And so if I was upset or angry and I was like just trying to keep my cool, I always had it in red. So that way, if anybody had questions, they'd be like, "Oh, the totem is red right now." Phil does
I like it.
Disturbed right now. And then, like after I calm down, I flip it back to green. They'd be like, "Oh, okay, here's a panic," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, good to know." And then I flip it back to red for a few minutes, let me process it, and I'm like, "All right, I'm ready for the next."
But one thing that's actually not important, critical, but one thing that's useful as a young ALD is to have a basic understanding of how to read music. And that you don't need to be able to play the piano like virtuoso, but you need to be able to at least when the designer says when was that big key change, to be able to look at the score and find out where the key change was. You don't need to know what the key change means, but have that basic. One of the best things I ever did was when I was in 11th grade. I took piano in high school, so I'm able to read a score, but reading an orchestra score, no way in hell. But I can read a piano score, which is what we use at the tech table. It was called a piano vocal score, so I could. But I can't play the piano to save my soul. But I could read music, so it's a useful tool. It's not a game changer, but it is a useful tool.
Also, if you have the ability to speak a foreign language, that can be a huge help as well. So even though you don't have to be fluent, but if you can get some understanding of Italian, French, and German, it can be a huge help. I don't speak any of those languages, but I can understand quite a bit of most of them, and it's just. And that the opera business is the most international of the arts, I think. I mean, dance companies they run all over the world, but they stay as a company, and they don't really need to they go somewhere for a week and then they go to another. But I mean, when you're actually trying to do a production in another city, then knowing a little bit of the language is going to be a huge help. Now, also then both in working in another country and also in whatever language that the production that you're working on is written.
I like to say that I can speak lighting design German.
Yeah.
So I know the important words that a lighting designer would need to speak, but in German, like grosse, kleine, things like that.
Exactly.
Well, we have about 10 more minutes in our roundtable here, and I know Slew has a question, as does Melanie. So let's go to Slew.
So my question might be a little bit off topic, sort of, but like I haven't really worked in a repertory kind of situation, in my school education. So I'm just wondering how that works here. Because the only place that I've seen it really has been in Moscow, where pretty much everything is in rep. And the few places that I saw had like semi-truck trailers on train tracks that they would just wheel into the theater, unload the whole set and the rig. And then at the end of the night, they'd load it back in and wheel it off the stage, which I know that's not really how places like the Met would probably do it. But I'm just wondering, like, the physical, how does it happen?
Well, first of all, your reference, European theaters and opera houses are so much more advanced technically than most of the U.S. opera houses because they have federal support. They have funding by the government, so they have more equipment than most of the theaters in this country. John at the Met has probably more equipment than anybody else. Scenically, but even there, compared to European theaters, it's still a lot of guys. I mean, they can have 100 carpenters on a show sometimes. So we are not as advanced in the technical theater side as European theaters are, and even Chinese theaters now. The ones that are built there are full of all sorts of technical gear that we don't have. So it's that's, I think, the biggest difference between this country and other countries as far as the opera house scheduling and all of that.
But with regards to how it works, is we have at the Lyric, I have a rep plot that has 9 electrics. I have my first bridge is a walking bridge. So like the Met, they've got 4 walking bridges where the guys could walk back and forth on. I only have one, and on that electric, I've got 50 source 4s that designers can do whatever they want with. Then on the stage, I've got a sidelight system that's focused when you walk in, a backlight system that's focused when you walk in, and a slew of moving lights. The guest designers can add a couple lights if they want, for specials if they need to, or rearrange some of the moving lights if they want. Not allowed. It's an because your production of Butterfly works with Duane's production of Aida, and I can't give you both the same place at the same time. It's time to rehang the fixtures all the time. So, and then the front house, you could focus as you want. I don't care. We try to refocus about 100 lights a day, which is small for the compared to the Met, but it's quite large for other companies. And then it used to be, back when I started, it was about 250 lights a day when we refocused. Now thanks to the wonderful world of moving lights, it's down to about 100. So we still refocus on lights every day. The entire deck is placed every day for the shows. You can add booms and whatnot to your blue in the face. But overhead, you've got maybe 5 specials if you're lucky that I can give you. But other than that, you've got to use the rep focus that's there. You could change color. But
yeah. Well, at the Met, it's kind of funny. It's kind of like what you talked about, like when you see it in Russian houses like the Mariinsky and stuff. But we have a stage carpenter's crew, a props crew, an electrics crew. The minimum crew, meaning the least amount of people we can contractually bring in on the electrics crew, is 38 people. And I've never seen a minimum crew in my career. We need more. And same thing with the props department. Don't even ask about the stage carpenters. I think the minimum is 30, but there's always about 60. For big shows like our Tritico, we need about 85 stage carpenters to push stuff around. And that's not even including the service crew, which is the crew that's responsible for staging and moving around the scenery to make sure that our 6 performance a week, repertory rotation actually works. And they're going to add more performances pretty soon when we start doing matinees. And then we own 3,000 ocean containers at the Port of Newark. And that's where the scenery and some of the lighting lives. And we take in and take out about 20 container trucks, sometimes a day, of scenery. Block Amsterdam Avenue, the cops come yelling at us, there's fist fights, there's all types of fun stuff going on all the time. And then for me, it's the rotation of the lighting equipment, because like Chris says, we have a new overhead rig, Lightbridge 1, very much like this, but we have the ability to do a lot of special electrics. I have 2 warehouses filled with lighting equipment. And today it's just bought a few more 6K Big B yokes that, are needed in a big production. It's huge. So, and, so it's a bit different, but it's just the bigger you get, the more chance you have to fail. So like when designers first come to the Met, they go, I want this, that, and that. And it's not to be insulting, but I'm like, you can't handle that the first time. Listen, it's simple, like Duane can have whatever he wants. It's fine.
I know, but I mean, the thing is, you don't. I mean, when you first get into those spaces, you don't realize how little time you have, and you can have a plate that's much too full to be able to do what you want to do, and you can just, be spinning in circles and not get anything done. So John's right. I think you have to at some point say no. Your eyes are bigger than your stomach at that point, and you can make a beautiful show with less of that. So let's cut it back a bit.
Great. I think we have time for one more question from Melanie.
Hi, yeah, my question's quick. Chris, I'm glad you brought up the reading music issue with opera, because I was assigned an opera to design last year and I do not read music at all. I was very lucky that it was in English. We did Dado and Aeneas. And I think I definitely could have implemented a lot more into my design if I were to be able to read music. And I did try to teach myself, and it didn't go very well. So I'm just wondering if anyone has any good resources or books or anything they might be able to recommend so I can jumpstart that and maybe try to teach myself a little bit better.
I don't know off the top of my head about resources to do that, but one thing you could do is some operas are much more complicated than others to read the music for. Like, whatever you do not pick anything that's written in Czech, because God help you.
Go start with Stravinsky. Do it.
Oh, sure. Bartok.
Italian composer. His name is Puccini. He wrote some really easy ones. No, I'm dead serious. excuse me. I'm sure on the internet you could find the piano vocal score for Puccini. I would get and then listen to it. And you literally can follow the music and see as the notes go up, the singing goes up. And that's literally the beginning steps. You don't necessarily need to know everything, but that will help you be able to see the music. It sounds corny as hell, but you can actually see the music going up, and they sound like they're singing higher. And that's all you. Sometimes I'll even do that. I was like, oh, it's repetitive. It's doing this, boom, 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 boom. I will look at the score for notes that do this. It's like, oh, that's where they are. So it is sometimes very simple. You don't need to be a virtuoso, but at least that'll get you started and trying to figure out. But again, Puccini, there's this guy named Joe Green, Giuseppe Verdi. Do him a lot. He's easy. Traviata is an excellent. It's my favorite opera. Go simple, and then dive into the Russian and the Czech operas, because God help you.
You didn't even mention Wagner.
Wagner, you get a page. It's crazy. Like I said, Poesie is this long. It's 3 hours long. Damrong is this thick. It's a lot smaller. It's 5.5 hours long. You'll take 20 to get through one page. Where in Puccini, you're flipping pages constantly. It's going this fast.
Exactly.
Wagner, you'd be asleep by the time the first page is over.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is learn a bit about musical notation, so that even if just knowing what forte and pianissimo and all those things, what they mean, so you can be hearing that as you're looking at the score as well, because that'll help the cueing as well. And a key change, like we talked earlier, is just anytime you hear a key change, you're going to probably say this would like you would feel good here. So I don't think you should give up as far as being. You don't have to learn music completely. If you can just get some of the big ideas from looking at a simple piano score, I think it would help you a lot.
Yeah, I mean, how many of us can really read music fluently? I mean, I can't. I don't know. So Connie's showing off.
9 years of classical violin.
Michael's I got this.
My parents' legacy. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one time I heard actually AD at the Met recommend somebody who was coming for a visit, a student who was coming for a visit, and they asked the same question, and they said, well, why don't you go take a sight singing course? So I know it sounds really crazy, but they're like, you don't have to be a singer, but you can get together with somebody, and in particular, a piece of music that you're interested in, like probably along the lines that what Chris was recommending, if you actually sing a bit and it's terrifying or hum along, like it starts to sink in a bit more, like there's no better recipe than doing it. And yeah, just find a place where it's not embarrassing, because I've done it.
The thing that's crazy is that after you listen to some operas, you'll be watching TV and you'll hear a song on the television like, that sounds familiar. And then my wife also works in opera, and we will instantly start having a contest who can pick the opera that song is from, because you'll be amazed how many operas are in television, in commercials. And we both look at each other, and we call each other opera dorks because we were able to pick out the opera first. So.
Mitchell mentioned that his school has an intro to music reading class in the music department, and maybe your universities have something similar. That might be a good way to do it. I wanted to thank
drama, but yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Thank everybody for being with us tonight. Thank you all, professional industry lighting folks who have taken time out of your schedules to join us and do this. I'll kick it back over to Duane for one last bit. If there's any sort of parting pearls of wisdom that you'd like to impart upon these students, or anyone else for that matter, but we'll kick it over to you, and then we'll go ahead and end.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank everybody that's here as well for joining me on all of this. And as far as pearls of wisdoms go, I think it's it really is all about. I mean, I always say that to the apprentices in Santa Fe when I'm down there, is that it's a contact sport, and you just need to go out and make as many contacts as you can, and that's how you will sort of get into the business and stay in the business. So don't be timid about. If there's an opera house in the city that you're living in, and you see that they're in rehearsals for something, find out who you can call up and contact, and see if you can sit in and watch a rehearsal. Because there's nothing better than seeing the process by sitting back 2 rows behind the production table and watching what happens. So if you can, go experience what it's like to be in the room long before you end up at the table, because you learn a lot just by being in the room at the same time. So that's my little bit. And I got to thank you all very much for being here.
Yeah, thank you all. We really appreciate it.